Welcome to the Method Podcast. I'm Aidan Simpson, and this is where we talk to designers at Google about work, life, and the future of design. Today's episode is a little different. It's being hosted by design advocate Liam Spradlin, who's also launched another Google podcast, Design Notes, which you can learn about on design.google. But today, Liam interviews senior interaction designer Roman Nurik about his work on Firebase, design systems, and the unique challenge of designing interfaces for developers. So enough from me. Let's get into it.
Roman, welcome to the show. Just to kick things off, I want to ask what you're up to and what your day-to-day is like.
For the last year and a half, maybe 2 years, I've been on the Firebase team. And I'm one of our leads in terms of the Firebase console. So we have a bunch of different parts of Firebase. And for those that don't know, Firebase is essentially a developer platform that lets you build great apps on Android, iOS, web, and stuff like that. And my job is to essentially make sure that when you're using Firebase and you're using specifically the Firebase console that lets you manage a bunch of things, lets you create projects, lets you see your database, lets you see your analytics and stuff like that. My job is to make sure that that experience within the console across all the different features of Firebase feels consistent and really feels like a single platform that you're working with. And so as part of that, I look at things like what's the design system of the console, what is the overall navigation, what are the components, visual styling, and it's not just me. We have a team of folks that are working on that. But I look at my role as helping curate a lot of the decisions and trying to figure out, where should we be moving? Where are we now? What new things are we adding to Firebase? And how do we make sure that the system, if it doesn't directly help solve those problems, how can we evolve the system to better fit those problems? So that's kind of like my high level role. On a day-to-day basis, I'm still in Sketch on a daily basis. I do a little bit of front-end engineering as well. So I'll go in and help our engineering team with the Angular code for the Firebase console. We do some prototyping. We do a bunch of different things. But yeah, that's kind of a high level overview.
I want to talk about design systems because I think that we're seeing more and more companies and organizations kind of expose their design systems to public designers, and I want to get a feel for how you approach that on Firebase.
Yeah. So when you look at any Google product, we all have a baseline of material design, right? So when you look at the basic visual styling of color and buttons and text fields and all that type of stuff, we all across Google at this point, we start with material design. Firebase is in an interesting spot in that first, it's kind of, it's Firebase. It was an acquisition. And so the brand, it's not like Google Maps or Gmail. So there's some unique kind of interesting challenges there with how do we position Firebase and how do we make sure that it's clear that it's a Google product, but also, that it's also kind of its own thing. So there's an interesting thing there. But then that obviously filters into the design system. What are the colors that we use? What are some of the visual choices that we make? And like I said, we start with material design, but we also exist in a broader ecosystem. So, when you use Firebase, you're also interacting with Google Cloud Platform. There's also connections to Google Analytics and AdMob and AdWords. And that also is another challenge that we have to figure out. How do we make sure that the experience is consistent if you're a developer that uses Firebase and a bunch of those other things? And so having all of those products use material design as a basis helps, but it also means that we have to think about, well, are we choosing a specific kind of deviation from material design or an extension of material design that's different than how one of those other products would extend material design? I know that the ads and analytics team have done a lot of extension of material design as it applies to desktop apps. And specifically really complicated, deeply hierarchical pickers, for example. You can imagine a drop-down picker, but oftentimes in really enterprise type use cases or really advanced use cases, you're not just picking one thing. There's this deeper little subflow of picking things. And so there are a bunch of different components that the analytics team and the AdWords team have come up with. And there's many different ways of doing that, of solving that type of problem. So we sometimes also think about are we solving that problem differently? Should we be solving it in the same way? And then like, what are the differences? So there are definitely challenges there. But I think that at the end of the day, you know, we look at it as what is the best experience we can give people. It almost comes back down to, you know, what are the things that you should be consistent with? What are the kind of the levels, the tiers of consistency? We look at, first and foremost, if you're using Firebase, we should be consistent within the product, right? Almost regardless of material, regardless of any other products, if you're using Firebase, we should just be internally consistent. And then above and beyond that, we try to look for opportunities to make sure that your experience across these different things is coherent. Another thing I wanted to mention is, I'd say that, you know, material started as this kind of really focused small set of components, right? And it's a design system that has got a lot of principles, and it's excellent. It's been a great kind of baseline of kind of design decisions. But I think that, you know, the set of components that are publicly out there and that are internally looked at, it's relatively small. It doesn't really solve every possible interaction problem, like the one I just mentioned around like deep hierarchical pickers. And I think that what's ended up happening is, you know, it started small, and then each of the teams, like the ads and analytics team, the cloud team, and the Firebase team, we've taken the existing components and extended it to solve some of the problems that we've wanted to solve. And so I think that material, in a sense, has evolved in that way, in which each team that comes across a new challenge and solves that problem will share out their work. So the ads team and the analytics team will like share their work, and then, you know, we may start using that. Like, oh, that's a great solution to this problem that we also have. And I think one of the great things is that we have a couple of processes in place where those teams could then present it back to the material team, and that can be brought back into the original spec.
Yeah, and I think that's important to recognize too. Like, I think from the outside, or going into this question, I would think that material design is a system inside which something like Firebase exists. But in fact, it's kind of the opposite. Like, material forms a foundation that all these products can build on. And using a system like material at Google's scale means that it can be collaborative and kind of evolve as it needs to.
Mm-hmm. I look at it as, well, we talked a little bit about the kind of that baseline, right? So like materials core environment of like surfaces and shadows and ink and stuff like that, that is not something that really that evolves, but at a much slower pace. That's like the almost like the pyramid of things that is material. That's at the very baseline, right? But then like the components that sit on top of that, any new components that we build, or any new components that the cloud team builds and so on, those all sit within that same baseline, that same framework. We try to very rarely kind of break outside those bounds. Every now and then you'll need to, just because it ends up being a better user experience. And that's one of the things that is always tough to know, is like, should we deviate from this fundamental baseline thing or not? And I think that's something that the material team has been very good at. It's like, well, if this little restriction at that very lowest tier of describing what material is, if that restriction is causing a bunch of difficult decisions to be made higher up, is that a point to change it? But I think that so far it's been pretty great working within the system of, surfaces at elevations and things like that. It's made a lot of decisions actually a little easier. But I think that's something where there's definitely an evolution at the tiers on top, right? The component level, the pattern level, this is a toolbar, right? And this is how like a toolbar should be laid out. That's more like an opinionated part of the platform or the system. I think that the evolution that has happened there has been really, really interesting. And that's where I think that most of the teams operate in, is tweaking the patterns, tweaking things like that.
So I want to go even a little bit deeper into the tactical side of defining Firebase's system through material. So what kind of artifacts are you creating that help keep that system in line?
Yeah, so at a very, very tactical level, most of our team uses Sketch. And there's an excellent template that I think that comes with Sketch that is basically the material template. And if we look at like the very origins of the new Firebase console, we were all basically using that template. It's like, great, we got some buttons, we got some icons and toolbars and things like that. I think we've started from that. And then, over time, we've basically built up a set of sketch symbols, essentially, that iterate on that like slight variations on buttons or new components that are like a toolbar, but not exactly. Stuff like that. And over time, we've codified those into a new set of components, some of which are generally shareable with other teams and some which are pretty specific to Firebase. And the way in which we've basically had these symbols and like these basically like these patterns across all of our sketch files in the team. And so a couple of us basically then took those components and some of the patterns that we'd been seeing and started like defining some real kind of logic around when to use this and why this is different from the equivalent in material and so on. And through that, we basically created this kind of master sticker sheet, which actually includes a bunch of material stuff. Like we didn't do anything to material checkboxes or radio buttons or anything like that. We still use, honestly, if you ask any kind of person to look at the Firebase console, they'll say, oh yeah, it's material. It's like a tweak on material, but it's material. And so we still use a lot of those elements. But the things that we have changed and the new things that we've added, we basically have those sitting side by side with those material elements. And so we went from there, and I'd say that I'm not exactly describing the right chronology of events, but these are some of the things that we have. We had the sticker sheet that had all these things. And we also, when you look at what's publicly documented on material, you have the material spec. So I'd say essentially the design system is codified in a way that's very similar to material. There's a sticker sheet that is very similar to the template for Sketch, and there's a spec. There's also, and by spec I mean like a style guide, right? And there's also like obviously internal components that our engineering team uses. A lot of that is just more proprietary and not super interesting to talk about. It is built in Angular and Angular material, so it uses some obviously like very well-known public frameworks, but a lot of the specifics are just specific to Google, not really interesting.
When you're deciding to codify a new component or some change that you've made, at what point do you decide to codify that?
It's an excellent question. Right now we're going through the process of, it's funny, we're like a couple of levels deep here. We're defining the process for creating components. And we're going through the exercise now, and a lot of it is just retroactive, where we've looked at, and I think this works in a lot of small teams that grow over time. We've looked at our practices over the past 2 years and decided that, I looked at what has worked well and what hasn't, and started kind of codifying those things. Like, here are the successful components that we've made, and here's how we came about those things, and we're starting to just now codify that. So looking at things like, 4 different designers were solving the same general problem, same class of problems, 4 different ways, and basically met together and decided, like, here's the solution that solves all these problems in the best way, and then kind of started expanding that and componentizing it, saying, here are the ways in which this component can change, like size and semantic meaning and color and things like that. You could imagine like a message component. This is actually our current kind of case study, like a message component that basically like tells the user some small piece of information, like, hey, what you just did was successful, or there was an error while doing this and that, right? And we went through this study where we looked at like how have designers on our team tried to solve that? What was the solution that worked best for that? And then how was it extended to cover success, failure, warnings, and then obviously also in different sizes, like a small warning, a larger warning, things like that. So I think it's to answer the question maybe more concisely. It's been an evolving process. We're just now starting to think of like what is the overriding process on how to componentize something like that.
Right. So something that solves a problem in one place doesn't necessarily deserve a place in the spec yet until it's been proven out through all of its various dependencies and states and stuff.
Yeah, it's very easy to optimize too early, like over eagerly optimize something. And it's definitely something where we only really try to componentize something when several designers or several teams or several products are starting to use it. So if it's something that's really, really specific or solving a problem that's really specific to, say, Firebase Test Lab or Firebase Database, then it's not something that necessarily needs to be componentized. But as soon as it's used not only within one product, one subpart of Firebase. As soon as it's used across different parts of Firebase, that is like instant like fodder for componentizing and standardizing that.
So coming back up out of the rabbit hole that we've dug a little bit,
Yeah.
I want to talk about, I know one thing that we believe at Google is putting the user first and all else will follow. And I think part of that for me when designing something is thinking about the context in which the user is using something and what other things they might be using. So you're building a product, a really large product for developers primarily. And how does that impact the system? In other words, like how do the other tools that developers are using with Firebase kind of feed back into your design decisions?
Yeah, and this is something that's very difficult to do, right? Because a lot of consumers are just now becoming developers. In general, we want to make sure that anybody that wants to use Firebase has a great experience using Firebase. That means somebody that's just getting into development and just for the first time is discovering this whole thing of like, oh, like I need to store some data in the cloud, or somebody that's building a mobile app and just wants to get some analytics. I mean, normally if you're just learning how to build a mobile app, you're not going to jump in and get analytics, but you may start thinking about, messaging, like cloud to device type stuff, like being able to have a chat client or something like that, right? We definitely want to make sure that if you're a beginner or if you're an expert developer that you feel at home in Firebase. That's one of the challenges. You can't solve for that entire audience. You can't make something that is at the same time perfect for, people that don't know anything about development, but also like people that are that have been developing for 15 years. One of the principles I think that we have is just this idea of progressive disclosure. So let's make the initial view of things as simple as possible. And this is cases where I think we differ in some ways to some of the other developer products that Google offers. But for us, we really want to make sure that if you come into Firebase not having ever really built even a database or not ever having done any sort of analytics, that you have a good experience.
So I guess it comes down to, complexity that a developer might need. Complexity isn't necessarily a bad thing as long as it's manifested to the right person at the right time.
And there are obviously like generalizations that we do make. Like for example, developers like or desire more dense interfaces. We do make some generalizations like that. Like if you compare something like Inbox to Firebase, you're going to notice a bit more white space. There are some generalizations that we make that generally do pan out. But again, it's difficult because you may imagine like, oh, you're designing for developers. That's such a small audience. If you ask anybody that works in the developer space at Google, it's like, no, there are many, many different types of developers. It's tough.
Right.
And obviously, one thing I should call out is we try to use user research as much as possible. It's tough because there are fewer developers out there than there are, say, consumers. But over the course of a couple of years now, we've had a lot of good data points, and we're obviously continuing to evolve on how we can make the experience even better for all developers, not just kind of like a narrow segment.
I want to pick out one thing you mentioned, which is density, because I know that's a big conversation topic for people who are implementing material. So how do you think about density? How do you apply it? When is it appropriate?
It's a tough question. I think one of the things that you go back to, what defines material design, and there's things like basics like the grid, right? Like the 8-dip baseline grid, and there's also higher level elements like say toolbars that sit on that grid, right? So like a toolbar is 56 dips or 64 dips tall, right? When we make decisions to make something more dense, like let's take for granted that we want to make something more dense to be able to fit a little bit more information into a screen. But one of the things that we make sure that we follow is we still try to follow some of those grids. We still try to adhere to the rules. Like we don't like stop using shadows, but we do try to, at least evolve things such that they work in a slightly higher density world. So one example is, there's the 8-dip grid. We started using a 4-dip grid, which gives us a little bit more flexibility. The other thing I'd say is, density is one of those things where it depends what you're looking at. So I wouldn't say that Firebase in general is more dense, but we do focus a bit more on the content rather than like the Chrome. And so we've made the Chrome itself a bit more dense. Where the Chrome is a bit more dense, it's given the content a little bit more room to breathe. And there we make choices at almost an individual page level of like, what is the best way to present this information? Should it be dense? Should it be sparse? And I think that there we've been a little bit more, let's just say, liberal with using space to ensure that like things are grouped correctly and so on. So when I say things like density, I really mean like at the Chrome level, and sometimes for some types of content, for example, like for tables. But a lot of our screens are actually, developers always still give us feedback like, oh my, there's so much space here. Why don't you like you can fit so much more in here. It's always a balance. It's always a trade-off between adding too much or showing too much and showing too little.
There's this instinct to desire density in something that's complex. What do you think about that? Is it just like, how do you decide what the better experience is?
I think density is essentially a trade-off between just amount of visible information and, I mean, one of the reasons people use space, right, is for Gestalt, right, for better grouping and better comprehension of complex things. I think it's always a trade-off there, but we always go back to what is going to best communicate the hierarchy of a screen. So we will very rarely sacrifice space just to fit more in the screen. More often than not, when we make things a little bit more dense, it's because it doesn't fundamentally influence the hierarchy. It's an opinion, right? Like, yeah, I think this works better at 64, and I think this works better at 48, right? So we definitely think mostly about hierarchy. In all of our reviews, the conversation is almost always around, is this expressing the right visual hierarchy? Is this making the content easy to consume? We've tried to focus on tooling that helps us work better as a team and helps every designer essentially be on the same page, gives us all the same starting point, just so that our output is more consistent and we almost like present things to our engineering team as a single unit. It's like it almost doesn't matter which designer built this. This was produced for us and like kind of this was envisioned by the single UX team, design team. So that's one of the things that we focus on a lot is how can tooling better help us create things more consistently as a team. I think there's actually a ton of room for growth in design tools like Sketch and Figma and so on, going beyond just like overrides of symbols and things like color and font and all that, and going much deeper into semantics. This also gets into a question of, well, how do you define those semantics? How do you as a design system kind of owner, for lack of a better term, how do you define that in this tab bar, only tabs should go, and when you drop a tab in, like here's how it should be laid out and all that. And this actually goes into maybe the question of like, should designers code and like, are there other ways to define that kind of logic? I can definitely imagine if there are tools that existed like that, some of the folks in our design team could own those components and some of that logic and help grow that logic, and that would help benefit everybody else. So if I or somebody else on our team could like write that small bit of code that says for the tab bar symbol, only tabs should go here and like they should be aligned here, here, and here. If we could do it that way, I feel like that would benefit every other designer. I see this all the time where like our design team is just like they're dropping components on and they're just spending all this time like arranging things. And when there are rules in place, and you just want the default behavior or something, it should be much, much easier. It should just work out of the box. Obviously, there should always be room for deviation from a standard or from that logic. When you want to deviate, it should be as easy as like detach symbol instance or like flatten this or something. But I think that there's, basically to summarize, I think there's a lot of room for having smarter and smarter symbols and components and things like that.
I think the point about coding a system is really interesting because I could see like there are aspects to components where, for example, a user's perception of a component might be defined by its visual appearance or it might be defined by its behavior. And depending on which one that is, you might create different rules, which I think would be pretty difficult to represent in a graphic interface. I also want to get into the tools that you've built.
Sure.
Because you're a designer on Firebase, but I still consider you kind of a stealth design advocate because you've built so many things for the community over the years. I want to understand, your like instinct for tooling, because I know there's been cases where we're talking about a design. I'm showing you like how I approach something in Sketch, and you say, "Oh, that could be a tool." Like I know exactly how that would work. Like it's already implemented in your mind. I want to get a feel for how you do that, basically.
My general process for that is there's two. There's two that I can call on. The first is anytime I see a designer doing something that takes a long time, or doing something that's just like, like doing the same thing over and over and over again, just like 100 times or something. Anytime I see something that just generally like a computer can be better at this, I love building tools that empower the designer to tell a computer how to do something rather than doing it themselves. I mean, time is a very precious resource for everybody. Literally anything that can save time for designers, I try to do. One example is the icon animator. So, I mean, that solves a slightly different problem, but like the Android icon animator that actually Alex Lockwood is working on making much, much better as part of this thing called Shapeshifter. But that originally started as like designers could go into the XML by hand and start messing with this type of stuff. You don't really need to know how to code to edit some values in XML. But it would save so much time, actually not only for designers, but for developers. It would just save so much time if there could be a visual interface for this, right? In Sketch, one of the things that we do is, on our team, is we lay out artboards horizontally, and then like basically vertically is like the set of flows, and then horizontally is the individual page in a flow. And I saw all of our design team basically like just dragging artboards around all day long, and it pained me because it's like a computer could do this better, not even better, just faster. So I wrote a very quick Sketch plugin that would just arrange artboards and number them correctly and all that type of stuff. So basically anytime it could save a designer or even developer any amount of time, like that is immediate fodder for a tool, whatever form that takes. The other thing is, this is more for the Android Asset Studio. I always think about how can we make design more accessible for developers. And it's more about, a developer may have an idea in their head of like what they want to make, or like, oh, I know I want my app icon to have this color and whatever. And oftentimes the developer just doesn't, they won't have not necessarily the sensitivity, but they won't have the command of their tooling to build the thing that they want. And so that's one of the things that I like doing is we know that there are some basic rules that we know to be correct or true or whatever. So for example, when you build an Android app icon, we know that you should have this shadow no matter what you do. And we know that if you have one of these common shapes, it should be this size. And we know that here's some of the specific effects that you can apply. And so that should be pretty straightforward. As a developer, I should be able to say, I know that my app does this, the calculator, for example. I know that I want the main glyph to be a calculator. Now, how do I make that like look good and fit into the system? And so that's again like a great situation where a computer can just help you do that. Writing a little bit of code that can just automatically produce the right thing for the developer. Basically, the developer specifies their intent. I want a green calculator icon, and it produces the right final assets. That's another case where like tooling is just perfect for something like that.
Is there anything beyond that intuition of either helping developers access design or making designers faster that lets you know that a tooling idea is particularly apt for the community?
Well, I would say there's a lot of ways to solve a problem, specifically an ecosystem type of problem. You can have better documentation around something. You can have a set of best practices. You can have trainings and things like that, right? And then tooling is another, usually. I generally am of the mindset that if it is possible to make a tool that solves the problem, or at least 90% of the problem, that trumps everything else. Because it doesn't necessarily enforce things, but it makes it so that there's no way you can go wrong. You just use the tool, and by nature, you have control over the output. Is the output good or is it bad or something else? So I would say that I just always think about tooling as like, does a better tooling solve this problem? And if not, then I'll look at other things. But I almost always go first to tooling.
What would you say is the most controversial design opinion that you hold?
I think we disagree on this, but there's been a lot of recent debate on like who are designers, what you is my product manager designer, is my engineer designer. And I think that there's been like some statements around like, oh, everybody's a designer. And I think I think I disagree with that statement. And it's almost like arguing semantics. I don't know how important this conversation is, but I think it's kind of silly to say that everybody's a designer. Primarily because, yeah, I get that everybody contributes to the process, but it's like, I mean, would you say that everybody's an engineer or everybody's a product manager? I think like at some point you need to have some sort of definitions of things. And so that's probably a controversial opinion. I know that if I were to tweet that out, like I'd get a bunch of, not necessarily like hateful replies, but a bunch of very good conversations around that. But that's probably one of the things that I would say is controversial.
You know, I'm surprised to hear you say that because I'm a very big proponent of the idea that everybody, at least of the idea that everybody designs.
Mm-hmm.
And I kind of approach that from the angle of like, if someone does something with intent or changes something, they have designed.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe there are like different levels of specialization, but I kind of think of it in the same way that I think of art, for instance. Like, I can't say that something isn't art because then I'm on the hook for everything that is art. So
right.
if you created something, that could be art.
Mm-hmm.
In the same way that it could be design if you created it with a specific intent.
I think on any sort of product or project or anything, everybody can wear the hat of designer. So for example, if you're a developer working on your own app and you're not working with a designer, then yes, you are the designer. And maybe it's better to say not necessarily who's the designer, but who's the decider of design? Who ends up making the decisions? And I think on many teams at Google, it ends up being designers and researchers and product managers that help all, like contribute to and engineers as well, help contribute to design decisions. But at the end of the day, the role of the interaction designer or visual designer is to choose the thing to move forward with. At some point, somebody has to choose something, right? And oftentimes it's engineers that actually make tweaks in the final output, like having it be a conversation between like, oh, this actually isn't possible. And so our final visible design to the user has to be this because this is the best mix of solves the problem, is close to what you kind of envisioned, but is also technically feasible and like will work well. And so I think that it's maybe the right thing is to separate who are the deciders of design, whose job is it to like choose a direction and move forward, and who's involved in like the decision-making process. Everybody should be involved in the design process. Everybody should be contributing design ideas. Who at the end of the day is curating all those ideas? I think that's the job of the designer.
Or maybe even to kind of meet in the middle, like who is actively designing versus who is designing, but perhaps in a more passive capacity.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a great point. So like one of the standard workflows is, come up with some wireframes or mock-ups, and we'll share that out to the product management team and to the engineering team, and we'll get a bunch of comments. When my product manager says, hey, I think this should work a little bit differently because of this, this, and this, that is a form of design. They're not like sketching it up, they're not mocking it up or anything, but that is a form of like choosing how the system should work. And at the end, at that point, the job of the designer is to help realize that direction, validate it with research and just like design sense, and see if that's the direction we should go in. If so, then pursue that. If not, then cut it off right there. So I think at this point, like you can argue semantics for quite a bit of time on this type of stuff. But.
So maybe I'll say everyone's a designer with a footnote.
With a footnote, that works. That works for me.
I think that's it. Thanks again for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, just a final word from us at Google Design. You can find more information and links to the things we talked about in the show notes at design.google. Check out Liam Spradlin's new Design Notes podcast, where he interviews creatives about the unique ways they approach design practice. And remember to sign up for the quarterly Google Design newsletter, where you can get the latest and greatest design stories from Google and beyond. All right, that's it from us.